Well, our featured speaker is Starhawk, and for many, she does not need an introduction, but I will just give it anyway. She's probably one of the most influential figures in modern earth-based spirituality and ecofeminism, and she is the author and co-author of 13 books, including the best-selling Spiral Dance, A Rebirth of the Ancient Religion of the Great Goddess, and the ecotopian novel, The Fifth Sacred Thing, and its sequel, City of Refuge. Starhawk founded Earth Activist Training. She teaches permaculture design, grounded in spirituality, and with a focus on activism. She travels internationally, lecturing and teaching on earth-based spirituality, the tools of ritual, and the skills of activism. Starhawk, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here today. I should tell you all, I had a little surgery yesterday to take off one of those little basal cell cancers. So I'm pioneering the Frankenstein look today, but it is temporary. It'll eventually go back to my normal face, such as it is. I'm speaking to you this morning from Yalamu, also known as San Francisco, which is the traditional territory of the Ramaytush Ohlone. And I really like this tradition of acknowledging the indigenous peoples of the land that we're on. So I invite you to put that into the chat if you haven't already. And if you don't know, to do a little research and find out, because I feel like it is acknowledging the true history of the places that we are and helps us connect a little more deeply and root more deeply into place. Thank you, Della, for that beautiful meditation, um, which is such a perfect introduction into what I wanted to talk about today. As you all know, I've written and taught for many, many decades about earth-based spirituality and about the old goddess religions of Europe and the Middle East. Um, and I have also, for more than 20 years now, been teaching and training people in permaculture, which is a whole system of ecological design. And for me, is kind of the practical end of believing that the earth is sacred. And the two of them come together in many ways, but one of the core ways is a shift in our thinking from our kind of conventional dominant culture view of the world as being made up of things that are separate and isolated and interact in kind of simple cause and effect ways, to understanding the world as a web of relationships, a web of life. And I think this is the worldview held by many, many indigenous cultures. I'm always wary about saying indigenous culture as if there was one, because there are thousands and many of them are very different. But I think that is a commonality that runs through so many different groups and people that live in close association with the earth. Understanding that we are not separate, we are interrelated. As humans, we're embedded in a web of relationships with family, with clan, with tribe, with nation. Um, as living beings, we're embedded in a web of relationships with plants, with animals, with insects, with fungi and microorganisms, and so much else. And out of that, I want to sort of suggest this morning sort of three core ideas that might help inform us and guide us in our peacemaking. In permaculture, we say, like, we start by observing nature. We take nature as our model, And out of that, we derive some core ethics and some core principles that guide our decisions. So, the first of those principles, I would say, is to embrace imperfection. Um, there's very little in nature that ever happens perfectly or ideally, and yet nature kind of goes along. You know, if you look at a tree and you examine every leaf, you'll find damage, you'll find insect bites, you'll find images of various kinds of disturbances, and those things actually often make the tree stronger. An insect bites a leaf and that tree puts out chemicals to resist it, and not only that, but sends out messages through that web of mycorrhizal fungi to alert other trees. I think for us as humans, and especially as peacemakers, that means recognizing our victories, even when they are partial victories. Um, because if we don't, then we end up getting discouraged and burning out. And as I look over the faces that are on this call, I see many of you who, like me, are, let's just say, no longer young things, right? We've been at this for a while, and and yet somehow we're still doing it. You know, we haven't burned out. And in order to do that, in order to maintain hope and optimism and energy over time, we need to acknowledge the victories that we have. So when I look back at my life, I think about being involved in the anti-war movement around Vietnam when I was still in high school in the 60s, being involved in the anti-nuclear movement in the 80s when after Ronald Reagan got elected. I remember so many times telling ourselves, like, if we just get through the next few decades without a nuclear war, that will be a victory. And here we are, you know, and we should celebrate that victory and know that the work of all the peacemakers, that huge anti-nuclear movement we built, all the anti-war movements, the intervention movements, even when at the time it didn't seem like we were winning, we were having the impact we wanted, yet over time that has built up. And again, here we are, we're still at it. When I look back at the last few years, you know, I hear lots of people disparaging the Biden administration and everything else, primarily because of Gaza, and Gaza is horrific what's happening there. But we also have to recognize that Biden, against all odds and unbelievable kinds of opposition, actually passed more progressive legislation than we've seen in many, many years. From the Inflation Reduction Act, which actually puts meaningful investment in dealing with climate change, to reducing the price of drugs and actually being able to challenge big pharma and negotiate the price of drugs, to supporting unions, to doing everything he could within his power to reduce debt and student loans. And I could go on and list a lot of them. Um, I often hear my activist buddies disparaging that or saying, I don't like Biden, or even saying the Democrats and the Republicans are just the same. It's like, whoa, right? They are, if ever they have not been the same, now is the moment when they are not the same. And if we say that, if we see that, what we're doing is we're actually undercutting our sense of victory, because those progressive policies, again, they're not just Biden thought of them out of thin air. They're out of years and years and decades of work of many, many people and many, many movements calling for social justice and calling for a world of more equity and more balance. And on this day of the fall equinox, a time when light and dark are in balance, we should celebrate every moment of balance that we can. The second principle I often think of is in ecology, in natural systems, diversity generates resilience. So embracing diversity and understanding that creating systems, creating groups, creating organizations that are more diverse in multiple ways, whether that's age, whether that's race, whether that's background, religion, gender, all of those things enrich us. It is a value for the group or the organization that we're in. It's not something we do out of charity or feeling we should be politically correct. We do it because it makes our groups and our organizations smarter, more resilient, gives us a broader perspective on everything we're looking at, gives us multiple different ways of seeing the world, experiencing the world, multiple historical lenses for looking at current events, and ultimately, it creates more abundance and more life for all of us. And along with that idea of diversity, there's a principle of edge, of ecotones, that in nature, where two systems come together, it creates a system that's often more dynamic, more energized than either one, where the ocean meets the shore. You get all these different niches of different conditions, times when it's wet, times when it's dry, that creates a variety of conditions and niches for life to fill. So you get this tremendous diversity of life. And again, in our human systems, edges can be places of conflict. You get two different groups of people, two different organizations, two different cultures coming together. They can clash at those edges, but that can also be a place where they instruct each other, inform each other, create resilience. I mean, I think about music, that where European music and African music came together, you get this tremendously creative edge that gave us gospel and gave us um, jazz and rock and roll and soul and rhythm and blues and hip hop and so much else, you know, out of that creative meeting. And finally, there's one other principle. I call this one feed what you want to grow. That if you're a chemical farmer, you go out in your fields and you see a bug or a pest, the response is, how do we kill it? How do we get rid of it? What poison can we dump on our food that will destroy this thing? If you're a permaculturalist or an organic farmer, you go out and you see a pest and you say, something's out of balance. What is this telling us here? Do we need to feed our soil so that our plants are more resilient? Do we need a diversity of plants so that we can attract beneficial insects that'll keep this pest in check? What's the root cause of this imbalance in our system? And how do we create the conditions that are going to favor what we want rather than favoring what we don't want? And I often think about this as questions of war and peace. How would the world look different if instead of saying, we have a problem with these people, how do we kill them? We say, what are the root causes of this situation and how can we favor the behaviors that we want? I especially think about this in terms of Israel and Palestine. I was in Palestine about 20 years ago for several years, volunteering with the International Solidarity Movement, same movement where recently one of the young volunteers was just murdered by the Israeli Defense Forces. I was in Gaza after Rachel Corrie was killed, a beautiful young woman who was defending a home from being bulldozed, and the bulldozer ran over her. Later in that same trip, Tom Herndl, another of our volunteers, was shot by an Israeli sniper. I got to meet Gazans and be in their homes and stay with them and know them as people. The situation there right now is horrific and heartbreaking. It's also heartbreaking for the Israelis and for the hostages and for the families who lost loved ones and who's, especially those who are still in that horrific limbo of not knowing if your loved ones are alive or dead or suffering. But that situation cannot be healed by attempting to destroy Hamas militarily, by decimating and destroying Gaza, by actually assaulting innocent people. All of that ignores the root causes, as if all of this just happened out of the blue with no reason for it. If Israelis really want peace in that region, they have to understand that real peace and security is only going to come through creating conditions that favor Palestinian self-determination and justice and freedom, and not by attempting again to just nuke and poison everything that is a danger or a detriment to you. And I think as peacemakers, it's important for us to be pushing for that and reminding people, there is now at least a tremendous movement for Palestinian justice. And that itself is a victory compared to what it was 20 years ago when we were just desperately trying to get people to pay attention to this issue. But 20 years ago, I was sitting in people's homes with their kids doing homework while tanks were shelling, the house, and bullets were thudding into the walls, and sitting there kind of looking like, should I be nervous? While the kids were doing their homework, and finally when the kids dove under the couch, I'm like, okay, now I should be nervous, right? How would you think that kids who grow up when they're under fire just trying to do their math problems, why would you think they wouldn't grow up to be Hamas fighters and to be angry and to want to do anything they could to create freedom and justice, no matter who it hurt? The more we bomb and kill and torture and assault people, the more we create resistance and the more we generate the conditions for war. So as peacemakers, let us push people to say, how do we create the conditions that are actually going to further peace, further cooperation, further interrelationship, and understand that we are all interrelated. So I'd like to just offer a quick practice for reducing some of our tension as we go into this time of the elections and things are so very tense and nervous, and just building on what Della has already done, maybe just take a breath. Feel your feet on the ground. And feel how gravity is pulling on your body. And maybe thinking of gravity as Fierce love for you, holding us close, keeping us from flying off into space. And maybe taking a moment, imagining yourself like a tree with roots in the earth. And feel those roots push all the way down to the center of the earth where there's fire that's still hot from the earth's formation. Take a breath in and release that breath and let it go down into that fire. And if there's anything you need to release, if you're ever feeling tension, if you're waking up in the middle of the night worried about the elections or something else, just take a breath. Let it go down into that fire and turn into pure energy. And then taking another breath, breathe it up through the roots, through your feet and legs, the base of your spine. Feel your spine growing up like a tree trunk. Take a moment, bathe your heart and all those connections to all living things that link through your heart. And up and out the top of your head like branches. Feel them reach up to the sky and swoop down around you. So it makes a circuit of energy. And into that you can breathe in some sunlight, some sky energy. Take it down. There's some place you need to nourish and take in some goodness. And just take a breath. Breathe it in, breathe it down, and let it go back to the earth. And blessed be. And happy equinox to you all.
But if you could raise your hand and
Yeah, I'm Charlotte Dennett. I'm from Burlington, Vermont, the Burlington WILPF. Hello, everybody. I want to go right to Starhawk's comments about needing to know the origins of the crisis in the Middle East. I've written extensively on it, and I want to throw out to you that for some reason, I don't understand. I've written books about how oil and energy play a huge role in these wars, in these endless wars. There's $500 billion worth of oil and natural gas off the coast of Gaza and Israel. And these attacks against Gaza have been designed by Netanyahu to keep the oil revenues away from the Palestinians. It's still going on. Netanyahu wants to build an energy corridor along the whole Eastern Mediterranean. And I'm sorry to say, I think some of the U.S. and the Saudis and some of the Gulf states are in favor of that, and that's why Hamas attacked, because it felt it was being pushed away. And so I support what you say in needing to understand the origins. And my question is, why can't people embrace this thought that oil companies, energy companies have been behind the conflicts, which are real? I understand all the divisions, but why do people have trouble embracing this thought, particularly because it would widen our movement and connect us with climate activists? That's it. That's my question. I wrote a book, Follow the Pipelines. It's all about their role in these conflicts.
thank you.
Thank you. I guess
No response or
well, I'm not sure why people, I'm not sure I can answer that question, but what I can say is we have to understand that climate and all of these oil wars are deeply interconnected. And that's why it's so important and to see these relationships. We need to get off fossil fuels, and that's not an easy transition to make, and it's threatens a lot of vested interests in many, many ways, and yet it's absolutely crucial that we do so. And doing so not only will address the climate crisis, but it will also address many of the horrific evils that are going on in the world, both in terms of the crises in the Middle East, in terms like the spills and the destruction that have gone on in places like Nigeria and Ecuador and Peru with, the oil companies. Um, And so, yeah, we have to see those relationships and understand that these are interrelated movements.
Thank you.
Wonderful. I actually have a question. If anybody else has a question, I don't see an immediate hand up. But my question is, what would you suggest to the people on the call to find out more about your permaculture design? Do you have any online offerings, or what would you suggest for people interested in learning more about that?
Thank you. What a great question. Yes, we have an organization called Earth Activist Training, and I'll put the URL into the chat. It's earthactivisttraining.org. And we have many, many online offerings, uh, including I'm going to be teaching several weeks about what we call social permaculture, which has to do with how we organize, how we apply some of these principles to our groups and our organizations and our movement building. I also have a personal website, starhawk.org, and we're just now putting up a whole series of magical activism and ritual skills classes for this fall. And I have a Substack uh, where I have been working on a book on long-term movement building that I'm kind of writing chapter by chapter as an experiment and putting it up on Substack. So you can find that as well. That's free. Um, every Friday morning at 9 a.m. Pacific time, I do an online meditation on Instagram um, on magical activism. And again, that's also free. You can join that or you can find it afterwards. So those are some of the different ways to connect. And as soon as I'm done answering questions, I'll type them all in. Jan.
Thank you. And thank you for your wise words this morning. Given your history as an activist and your work in various movements, um, are there something as a thing or some things you can point to now that you see that our movements, let's say for peace in Gaza and the rest of Israel, for example, that we are ignoring, that we shouldn't be ignoring?
You know, the movement for trying to bring about peace in Gaza is such a challenging one. I would say that we have, let's say, an administration right now that I believe is genuinely trying to bring about a ceasefire, a new situation in Gaza. They're doing everything they possibly can except for actually applying the levers of power that we hold on the situation. So one of the things we need to be doing is continuing the pressure to get them to actually stop funding and supplying the bombs and the military equipment and use that power more effectively. I also hear a lot of people so angry and so embittered that, again, people are saying, oh, the Democrats, the Republicans, they're all the same. Well, they're not the same. And to save your 501c4, I won't go in too much more detail, but just to say that the victory of someone who would basically allow the Israelis to annex the West Bank and Gaza and destroy any hope of a homeland for the Palestinians is much, much worse. And Um, that's something, we shouldn't ignore the real differences just because neither side is actually doing what we want them to do and what would be the right thing to do. The other thing I think that we have to understand, and I'm Jewish, I was raised Jewish, I grew up in the 50s when Israel was the great savior and hope, and um, just the assumed, wonderful, only good thing that came out of the horrific Holocaust. And I think we cannot afford to ignore the power of the narrative.
Mhm.
The narrative says, we were Jews, we were kicked around for 2,000 years, we were almost exterminated, and now we finally have a homeland of our own, and by God, no one's going to do that to us again. It's a powerful narrative. It's a
Yeah.
narrative I think we can all resonate with. The only problem with it is the Palestinians just don't figure in there.
Mhm.
As soon as you admit the Palestinians into the story, it ruins the story, right?
Yeah.
And I actually feel like that narrative is more of a driver than the oil or the water resources under the West Bank or the many practical aspects. Um, and and that's actually much harder to counter than purely practical or material aspects. Um, Especially in a time of rising anti-Semitism and, good old-fashioned 1930s style Nazism, even here in the United States. Um, so I think we cannot afford to ignore the strength of that story, and we need to counter it with a more hopeful story that might go something like, we have this homeland. Yeah, we were kicked around for 2,000 years. We were almost exterminated. And we have to do the tremendously difficult work of grieving and acknowledgement that in taking back our homeland, we have been oppressing another people. But if we do that, we have the potential for connection and friendship and for making the Middle East a beacon of hope and peace in the world, a beacon of cooperation and connection, and understanding that the Jews and the Palestinians, the Israelis and Arabs, we're cousins. We have far more in common than we have that separates us. And if we can recognize that, we could build a land that is a paradise for both people.
Thank you. I think Mary Beth had asked a question, and then I want to take Eileen in the chat. For those of us who are exhausted and feeling hopeless, how can we use the days of deep dreaming of the coming season to keep us positive and energized?
Um, I would say limit how often you look at the polls. Uh, you know, I've just come back from teaching in France and in Europe and in Ukraine this summer. And one of the things that keeps me energized is seeing this tremendous resilience in human spirit and people. We had 7 students we were able to bring from Lebanon to one of our courses in France who are in the middle of, the horrible conditions there. They've had 700% inflation. They've had uh, the horrible explosion a few years ago that traumatized everyone in Lebanon. They're continually on the verge of war and having this low-level war with Israel that continually threatens to break into a complete war. And yet here are these young people who are seed saving and planting gardens and working on healing the soil and thinking about how can they build regenerative systems. And that makes me tremendously hopeful. I was in Ukraine teaching in an eco-village with people who, again, in the midst of the war and everything else there, even when many of them, the area I was in was safe and far away from the fighting, but many of them were refugees from Eastern Ukraine, had families at risk, had loved ones they cared about, had lost loved ones. And again, they're thinking about how do we create, eco-villages? How do we regenerate agriculture? How do we explore new ways of living and how to live cooperatively? So reminding ourselves that no matter how awful the world lives, it is still full of people who are doing this work, often quietly, often without, a lot of news media around regeneration, around building hope, around creating better lives for themselves and their communities.
Thank you. I think we have three more hands, and I'm looking at the time, so I want to move it along. But I want to honor the people that have already raised their hands. So Eileen, you're first, and then Nancy, and then Darian.
Thank you. Thank you, Starhawk. This is wonderful and peaceful. I needed it badly. I was listening to a podcast by Ralph Nader on AIPAC. He, as you probably know, is a descendant of Lebanese immigrants. He's a son. And I was, well, he did begin, hey, yes, Israel has a right to defend itself, but Palestinians have the right to defend themselves too, which I bit into and enjoyed. But he also talked about the number of lives, half of kids are, I mean, Palestine is mostly kids, really, or was, and no electricity, no food, no home, under rubble, and yet the siege goes on. And how the ears are so blunted. I'm talking about the ears of the media, unless there is something that really happens big and you really get the attention and power. And then he talked about AIPAC. It was so planned, well planned, 300,000 people across the US were gathered as organizers to learn as much as possible about legislators, not only what they're doing in their respective jobs, but where they get their haircut, where they go to the dentist, where they play golf. And they went out and bugged them. And if they agreed to support Israel, yes, they got gifts. But if they disagreed, they were called anti-Semitic. And that can ruin a reputation even of billionaires or multimillionaires. As one particular person that Nader spoke of, he was actually Arabian. It's not a question, but yes, it is a question. Is it possible in this malinformation era and in the spinning of all sorts of, untrue things, to really gather up peace activists now and be safe? I'm one of the people who got hit by a car, who backed into me purposely at a vigil by some of these people who have one-sided vision. I'm fine, no injury except psychically a little bit for a couple of weeks. So what am I saying? The same thing I just said. Can we really build a movement, and how?
There's this saying in permaculture that the problem is the solution. I'm not sure that's always true, but it always makes you look at things more creatively. And if we look at the problem of disinformation and this fragmented media environment, it is also a solution in the sense that many people are now saying, look, people don't trust the usual media sources like they used to. You know, we aren't all tuning in to Walter Cronkite for the evening news, like, which some of you are old enough to remember.
Yeah.
You know, people don't even trust, you know, some of the alternate sources. But what people do trust is their friends, their relatives, their neighbors, hearing from individuals. So if we think of each of ourselves as a media outlet, each of us has a sphere of influence, big or small, and we can use that influence. We can speak, we can write, we can put things out, we can challenge some of that. I also think we need to get better at supporting those politicians who do stand up for justice for Palestine. And we lost two of them this year, the primaries that were funded by AIPAC, you know, Jamal Bowman and Cory Brooks. Uh, but, sorry, Cory Bush, not Cory Brooks. But there are, you know, some now who are standing up strong. And if you're looking for where do I put my, you know, vast amount of money to donate to candidates, like the $25 I've got this week, you know, think about actually supporting some of those who do stand up for justice and writing about them, talking about them, volunteering for them, because that's how we can counter some of that concentrated wealth and power.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy and Darian. I'm looking at the time, so if you could keep your question short.
And I'll try to keep my answers shorter.
Nancy? Not sure where Nancy went. Darian?
I'm,
Oh, Nancy's there.
no, Nancy's there.
Okay.
Yeah. Hello.
Hello.
Hello, everybody. And thank you so much, Starhawk, for your, I wouldn't say presentation, for your encouragement and remarks and wisdom. I wanted to come back for a minute to the focus on oil in the Middle East to just point out that we have a huge problem in the US with the continuation of fracking, oil and gas development, huge oil and gas pipelines that impact both indigenous land as well as poor communities, the infrastructure along our southern states that impact Black and brown and poor communities and impact health. So we really need to lift this up as well and help those communities and peoples and groups push back against the oil and gas and coal industry as we go forward. There is an effort now to work on a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. So that's another avenue for work to be done. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And yeah,
my question, I'm sorry, go ahead.
go ahead, Darian.
My question is, thinking of the time of year, we are momentarily enjoying the bounty of the harvest, and following the harvest comes the time when the leaves drop and the flowers die, and other aspects of change that can cause us grief. Certainly at this time, there are many reasons for grieving. And I wondered, Star, do you have any suggestions for how people can connect with their sense of grief and express that so that they are not crippled by it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think for me, that's one reason why we do rituals is to create places where people can connect with each other and face things like grief that are hard to face alone. Um, I think grief, especially, is one of those things where it's really helpful to get support. Um, and whether that's in a circle that's doing ceremony, or whether that's just a circle of friends where you can express the grief and cry together, or uh, do express it in whatever way you want. I also think that music and art and theater, all of those things, theater developed as ritual to create catharsis, to create that sense of terror and pity that allows people to move those emotions through. So finding ways that you can express it, or using music, finding those artistic productions that actually touch that grief can be a powerful way of helping to move that through and healing. And even just acknowledging the importance of connecting to the grief, I think is really, really vital.
Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a beautiful way to transition. Thank you so much, Starhawk, for being here.